Well, I want to thank you so much for joining us here at our HFA webinar. I'm Mark Schumacher, I'm the CEO of HFA. And today we're talking about something that you might have heard of, the election. This has been, of course, just an unprecedented time with the COVID crisis, but intertwined in this has been one of the most incredible election cycles I think we've ever seen. And what we're going to do today, we're going to be talking to our guest, Chris Andreessen, who's our lobbyist at HFA, is incredibly skilled at what he does and really is tapped into all the knowledge on Capitol Hill. And what we're going to do today is not so much just talk about what the other pundits have and the conversations you've been hearing about, you know, what strategy worked and things of that sort. We're going to talk a little bit about where we are as far as the election is concerned right now. However, really the expectations, the takeaways today for all of us are going to be how, with what we know of the mix in the Congress now and starting in January, what is this going to mean for the issues that are important to home furnishing retailers first and foremost, so all of you, as well as the rest of the industry. And so that's the key thing today, is to really understand what the landscape is moving forward. And we're going to talk more about that. But first and foremost, Chris, I want to welcome you. For those that don't know you, you know, we get a chance to talk multiple times a week, and I can just tell you that Chris has a level of understanding of what's going on that we just want to really tap into today. So first of all, Chris, I just want to, before we start anything formalized, can you even capsulize what the last 48, 72 hours have been as the crescendo to this unprecedented election season?
Right. Thanks, Mark. And it's great to be with you and everybody else who's joining us virtually again today. You know, we've kind of prepared ourselves for this moment over the summer into the fall. You know, we were kind of, as you mentioned, we kind of were building for this crescendo, but even then when you're living it in the moment, it's been hectic. You know, my personally and just professionally, just watching this play out over the course of the last several days, and then who knows prospectively how it, you know, how this plays out with legal challenges and things like that. You know, every election brings you something different to focus on and consider, and I think that this one is no different for both Republicans and Democrats. And I guess we'll get into some of those intricacies in terms of what the key takeaways will be for either party. But certainly, as we would have expected anyway, this election was and still is unlike any that we've ever seen, right? And the expectations may have kind of led us one way, but the events of election night, while they certainly were, you know, as we said, kind of a different experience, by and large, maybe except for a couple of places here and there, they were sort of as expected. But you know, living through it, following it, you know, sort of hour by hour, as everybody else is looking at some of these, you know, vote tallies and things like that, has been pretty interesting. So,
and the key thing I want to point out here is that, and you and I have talked about this, but I want the broader audience to understand this, is that the issues for our industry don't change. The people dealing with those issues and those that we have to work with, that's what's changing. And the bit of good news is while there are still certain aspects of this election that are still uncertain, we do have a lot of clarity when it comes to the mix in the House and the Senate, at least to a relative sense of certainty. So, Chris, let's do this. I want you to kind of get into this, give us this overview of sort of where we are right now, and then let's go ahead and we'll walk our way through this and see what we as an industry can do moving forward.
That's great. And so I'll start sharing my screen, Mark, and pull up a presentation, just some visuals for the crowd, as it were, to go through and start this presentation for all of our benefits moving forward. So just generally, here's kind of a quick overview of what we're going to look at. As Mark said, we won't focus too much on the election results, a little bit obviously, but not a lot. You can get that many other ways, but then really dive into, I think, have a more robust conversation, maybe some back and forth between Mark and myself, and we'd love the audience to participate too, in terms of, you know, the various impacts and what to expect maybe on some of these key issues that, as you said, Mark, the election didn't solve issues for us, right? It just maybe altered our approach and perhaps some of the considerations that we and many others in DC will make as we approach them moving forward. So don't want to go back too far to 2016, but I wanted to, you know, it's really interesting to see kind of, this is what we this is what the Democrats, certainly on the presidential side, were you know, trying to amend this time around, and then looking at the 2020 map to see how it shifted. Coming into this election, we all knew on the presidential side there were some key battleground states, right? The so-called blue wall, Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. So those were three states that President Trump won in 2016. As you can see here, right now, Wisconsin and Michigan have been called for Vice President Biden. That's a key advantage for him right now. Obviously, there's going to be a recount in Wisconsin, and I know that the president has initiated several, legal challenges. But to say this right now, another key area that has been in a little bit of dispute, especially within the Trump campaign, has been Arizona. Those 11 electoral votes have been assigned to Joe Biden right now by Fox News and by the AP. That gives Joe Biden a pretty strong advantage to get to 270, because if you factor in everything we know today and you factor in those 11 Arizona votes, that puts him at 264. So, you need 270. So you see that's 6 votes in Nevada. That obviously becomes critical, because 264 plus 6, you're right at 270. These votes are still coming in Pennsylvania, in Georgia. Those are 2 states, as I was talking to Mark ahead of time, that the Biden campaign feels that they may ultimately win. North Carolina appears to be more solidly in the Trump camp. But again, as you're trying to just look at the odds here as a path to 270, a path to victory, Joe Biden has several paths to victory here. President Trump, the way that the map sits today, without any changes, can't foresee how that's going to how that will happen, what the outcome that will have. But right now, the president would really need to flip Arizona back to red and then sweep all of these remaining states to get to a victory. So when you're looking at, again, Mark, kind of what we know, what we don't know, looking at it today, right now, you would certainly rather be in the Biden position, because they feel that they have multiple ways to get to 270, whereas Trump has to call the perfect play. We'll see how it ultimately plays out. These margins are razor thin. In Nevada right now, the margin and it favors Joe Biden right now is, I think, under 12,000 votes. In Georgia, the margin favors President Trump right now, but that margin is about the same, around 12,000 votes. Pennsylvania is a little bit of a wider margin for President Trump, but there's still a lot of votes to be counted there.
And remember, Chris, Florida came down to 537 votes back in 2000.
Right, back in 2000,
right.
That was really interesting.
So we're not sure who's going to be in the White House at the moment, but the layers below it, I guess we've got a little more clarity. Is that fair to say?
Absolutely, yeah. So perhaps one of the bigger upsets, quite frankly, was for Republicans in the Senate. So the Republicans were defending more seats than the Democrats this cycle, just based on them taking the majority in 2014. And so they had a lot of vulnerable members. They were really defending about 10 seats, which is pretty remarkable. Every 2 years, about 33, it goes 33, 33, 34 for the 100. They had a lot of exposure. And so the Democrats right now, the ratio is 53 to 47. So the Democrats, depending on the presidential, would either need a gain of 3 or a gain of 4 to control. As it stands right now today, the Democrats have gained 1 seat, and it was a net gain. So the Republicans took back the Alabama Senate seat held by Doug Jones, who had won in a special election a couple of years ago. And then the Democrats were able to flip the Arizona seat and flip the Colorado seat. Several other vulnerable Republicans prevailed. You had Joni Ernst in Iowa, Susan Collins in Maine. Tom Tillis is another one from North Carolina. His race still hasn't been called, but he appears to be on the path to victory. Mm-hmm. So if you take all of that, right now it's 50 to 48. There's 2 outstanding races in Georgia. One is going to a runoff. We know that. In Georgia, if you don't get 50%, automatically triggers a runoff. So there was a special election. There was a lot of candidates. I want to say 8 different candidates in that race. So nobody got 50%. So that automatically goes to a runoff on January 5th. There's another incumbent, David Perdue, who the last I checked, Mark, he was at 50.0%. So he was, I mean, the thinnest of margins. If he goes anywhere below that, it triggers an automatic runoff. As we said, they're still counting votes in Georgia. They're expected to be Democratic votes. So that the expectation is, and again, expectations can be wrong, obviously, as we've seen, is that will go to a runoff too. So you could have a scenario where the control of the Senate, right? If Democrats, if both of these Georgia races go to a runoff, and if the Democrats win them both, which I think is a big if you're playing the odds right now, but that would put the Senate at 50-50 with, presuming a Biden administration with a Vice President Kamala Harris breaking the tie.
Tiebreaker, right?
So that's where we are in that. So still a little bit of uncertainty, but again, I think the odds are still favor the Republicans there. And then again, for HFA and our membership, furniture retailers, one of the questions that we've had, and I think that the Biden administration and certainly congressional leadership has been very open. One of their top targets, if they had firm control, if there had been a so-called blue wave, was tax reform and going after some of those 2017 Trump tax cuts, especially raising the corporate rate from 21%, and it's been pegged anywhere from the mid to high 20s. Obviously, with Republicans controlling the Senate, that really, really factors into what kind of an agenda a Biden administration could advance. And certainly, it takes big reforms like tax reform, banking regulations, all those types of, broader, like democratic, more progressive priorities off the table. And it's, again, we're presuming a Biden administration in this scenario and a Republican Senate. That's a significant development. On that side of it, and the other side of it too, other priorities like infrastructure, which is a big issue for home furnishings retailers as well. There was talk about potentially going, rather big, a big infrastructure type package. It's much harder to do that when you have divided government. And so what we're looking at from here is how will these two sides negotiate? I've got a picture there of Vice President Biden with Mitch McConnell. Obviously, they've got a long relationship. The reality is Joe Biden has been in D.C. for almost 50 years. His reputation, his brand, so to speak, is bipartisan. He has really strong relationships. He's not from, historically, the more progressive wing of the Democratic Party that we know today. So those relationships, I believe, will come in extreme handy in a divided government situation. And whether the Senate's 50-50 or 51-49, to get something passed, you're going to have to work together. And so I wanted to throw that out there. And I will say one thing. I mean, we know that family means a lot to Joe Biden. He's shared his personal story. There was one Republican senator at his son Beau Biden's funeral. It was Mitch McConnell. So there is a history there. There's a relationship, and I think that there's some optimism that we can work together. It might take a little bit of time, but that's something to monitor. I will say too that it'll have an effect on nominations, right? I mean, Mitch McConnell could potentially continue to control the Senate, and so gone are the prospects of having some very liberal, progressive members in the cabinet. You're going to have to shift more to more centrist types, and I think that gives an edge to maybe some sitting senators, since the Senate has a history of like quickly nominating and confirming some of their own. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
I mean, also this concept of packing the Supreme Court. I mean, that goes away. Although I don't know if that was how viable that was anyway. I want to remind people, by the way, we're about 15 minutes into this hour, and already we got some amazing takeaways. Chris Andreessen is joining us. Chris is a lobbyist for HFA who leads a lot of our efforts in DC, and we've already talked about the fact that if Well, I tell you this, it doesn't really matter who's in the White House at this point. I think your points are very, very clear here. It's less likely major changes in corporate taxes. It's less likely that a huge infrastructure bill would go through. And you're questioning about about nominations, and the the conservative, a little more of a conservative approach to that. That doesn't matter who's in, because if the president wins re-election, then we're status quo. But your point is these other areas that if it had been Democratic control of everything, that would have been some major potential changes, you see as less likely at this point based on that.
Yeah, based on what we know today and kind of what we could project moving forward on the odds, if that were a hold mark, that's the absolutely correct. I will say that if President Trump were to be reelected, right, and again, it's still a possibility, maybe it's lower odds, and there were still a Republican Senate, everything that I've heard and seen is that there would be significant change within the president's cabinet in a second term, which is not unusual, okay?
Sure.
But if you had a Republican Senate, then again, you would have, we've seen kind of the harried pace of nominations and confirmations that have happened in the Senate over the last several years. Part of the reason that the Republicans are able to do that is because back in the Obama years, the Republican Senate was holding up some of these nominations. So the Democrats in control at the time by a slim margin lowered that threshold from 60 to 50. And so that's where we find ourselves. But that's those more progressive ideas, liberal ideas, whether it's packing the court, taking away the filibuster, those would appear to be off the table for now, pending final results.
Okay. And by the way, if any of you have questions you'd like Chris to address, you'll see on the right side of your screen the ability in chat there to put a question. Please do. We're going to be getting to questions throughout. But Chris, keep rolling. This is good stuff.
All right. Excellent. So and then so if we swing back to the House, obviously there were also great expectations for Democrats in the House. They've fallen well short of that, and there's a lot to go. Quite frankly, you can see on there about I guess it was about an hour and a half ago. I just did some double checking. From what I saw, there's about 27 undecided House races across the country. Democrats coming into election night were expecting to add anywhere from 5 to 10 seats to their majority. Republicans needed about a 17-seat gain to control the House. They're not quite there, but they really, I mean, as you can tell, they've had a good night on election night, and a couple days after, they're still in the +5 category. So that narrower Democratic majority, technically for folks like me who focus on committees and things, is going to mean less. There's going to be more Republicans on key committees, but at the same time, I think there will be some questions about what is the message of the Democratic Party right now. And this is something that we talked about, Mark, in terms of some of those key takeaways for both sides. I think that President Trump, if you look at some of the exit polling, built a really broad and perhaps different looking Republican voting coalition than we've seen in a long time. He was able to garner additional minority votes, be they African American or Hispanics, typical, Democratic voting blocks. He was able to really secure and strengthen his connection to the blue collar working class American, especially in those rural areas. That's where the Democrats didn't do as well, right? They did well with folks who maybe further to the left, some of those more progressive ideas, but their message didn't do as well. I think it comes out in the results on the House side in terms of those more central voters, and then obviously those rural voters. So I think that there will be some questions about what is next for the House Democratic agenda. So if you think about things like the Green New Deal, right, and that coming up for a vote in the House, I think that's, again, much like the Senate. I mean, even though the House is in Democratic control and there's really one rule in the House, majority rules, so you can kind of do what you want, but I think there will be some hesitation because I think the voters kind of sent a message here that, hey, your message doesn't quite resonate as well as maybe you thought that it did. Whether or not, Mark, that leads to leadership changes, I don't know right now. Back in 2018, when the Democrats took back control of the House and Nancy Pelosi was elected Speaker, she received 220 votes. You need 218. So it was a tight, she had to do some negotiating amongst her caucus. So I think that those are some open questions. The Senate is coming back into session next week. The House is coming back the week after that. And that's when some of those, leadership, higher level conversations will take place. But that's a significant development. Again, I think for HFA and our members in terms of what are we looking at as far as a House agenda, even though the Democrats are expected to maintain control, it'll be a smaller majority. So is there more of an opportunity to work on some of these more common sense, centrist, moderate ideas? Will there be more compromise? And certainly a lot of those conversations, Mark, really lead into kind of this next issue, which I think is really the biggest elephant in the room for perhaps all of us, is COVID-19 and a stimulus package. As many on the call may or may not know, certainly Mark and I and the HFA team have been heavily engaged with Congress over the course of this pandemic. Recently there's been all kinds of different negotiations, offers being traded back and forth. Ultimately, though, Congress had a very busy March in terms of passing legislation. They passed 3 separate bills in March and another one in April that gave some additional money to the PPP, through the CARES Act and then through additional legislation. But since then, they haven't been able to come to a bipartisan package with respect to COVID-19 relief. And again, it comes down to the price tag, right? You've had the Democrats started out in May at $3.5 trillion. That was the HEROES Act that they passed, which is significant. Again, to move something through the House, that was an achievement. Senator McConnell in the Senate said, let's pump the brakes, hold off, we're going to wait. The Senate didn't really fully consider something else, Mark, until September. And that was a much smaller package, around $500 billion. More recently, the Trump administration has been, negotiating with Speaker Pelosi and her team, and they've made some progress. They still haven't quite agreed to it, but they were in the $2 trillion range. Obviously, Mitch McConnell, and again, this is assuming the Senate stays in Republican hands. We may not know that until January 5th. Mitch McConnell right now still has control of the Senate as it is right today anyway. He's been in a different spot, and so is his conference. They've been more along the lines of smaller targeted type relief in the $500 billion range. Do I think that there's room for that to grow? I do. Will it grow to $2 trillion? I don't know that. I don't see that, at least right now. So, some of the things that are definitely on the table, and I think some of these areas are bipartisan, right? A second draw on the PPP. We know that the PPP was such a critical lifeline for many of our members,
Sure.
many of their suppliers, other industries as well. There was still about $130 billion left out there that Congress appropriated that wasn't ever loaned. So there's money there. There's been an effort to increase that. So if you add 130 billion to some additional funds that Congress has looked to put in there, there'd be more funds. There'd be an ability for a second draw of the PPP. It would focus on smaller employers, so under 300 employees, and it would really focus too on those employers that have suffered the most. So you'd have to have revenue decline of more than 35% when compared to a quarter from last year. I'll say this, Mark, that 35% number started out at 50%, and we made a big push to bring that down because we thought that 50 was a pretty high watermark.
Right.
And again, a lot of this comes, right, as we're seeing record cases of the virus across the country. This is an issue in terms of shutdowns. We know as an industry, we suffered through in April, May, and if not all, part of June. They were devastating. But now as virus cases pop back up, we have a coordinated campaign to make sure that our industry is viewed as safe and essential so that we can remain open, and that hopefully we won't have to go back. But we've always, our message to Congress has been, we need a if an emergency break glass scenario. We can't rely on a Congress that's like kind of locked horns and not able to get something done. We need access to that money if we need it.
But Chris, let me ask you a quick question though. Yes,
sir.
Do you suggest from what you're hearing is the second draw on the PPP then something that you feel has bipartisan branch support, meaning between the House, the Senate, et cetera? So you think that one is going to be on the table regardless?
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
And I would put that in a bipartisan bucket, right? I mean,
Okay.
that's really been kind of agreed to, Mark. And I would
Okay.
say for one of those issues, I mean, what it comes down to is leadership have a conversation, then the various committees work out the details, and
Right.
those conversations at a lower level have been bipartisan, and then they've been able to build some things together. So there's still details to work out, but yes, I would agree with that, and even some of the more detailed things like loan forgiveness, which is again a big piece to the PPP that matters to a lot of our members. We've been pushing for additional simplification efforts through legislation so that for those smaller loans, so considerably targeted those the smallest of
Right.
businesses, retailers in this case, would be forgiven almost automatically with a one-page form, things like that. So a lot of those efforts are already underway.
Right.
Um,
We've seen some movement there, no doubt about it, on the
right.
simplification. And I guess just for everybody listening in, are there any other elements that you think are firmly on the table? I mean, we know that the liability protections, we've got some real divisions there. We know that's
Mhm.
more of a GOP issue than it is for the Democrats. But is there anything else on this laundry list that you think, in a bipartisan way, that I know we're not going to count on anything until the ink dries, but that you have a high probability you think that it will go through?
So I think that there will be some form of expanded unemployment insurance.
Okay.
Again, there's details to be worked out about that. The Democrats have been at $600 a week as it went through the CARES Act through July. The Senate just recently, again, it didn't pass the Senate. It got the Republican support, but no Democratic support. Had a $300 per week through the remainder of 2020. Now, of course, here we are. It's not lost on us, right, that it's November 5th. Um, and
Yeah.
so we're talking about through 2020 like it's a long period of time. That would have to
Right.
be retroactive at a certain case, and then maybe it would go even further, into January. We'll have to see how that plays out. So there's details to be worked out. State and local funding has been another area where certainly Senate Republicans haven't been on board. You'll see there. I mean, the Trump administration has come up. There was $150 billion in the CARES Act in March for state and local governments. That issue's come a long way, but the administration offered 300 billion. I don't think that the final package will be quite that high, but
Mhm.
Mitch McConnell has signaled that he's open to that, and I think that the trade to be made is state and local funding for those liability type protections. And so
Right.
those are two of those issues that, on their face, are more partisan issues, but I think there's a
Mhm.
there's a path to getting bipartisan consensus, and then reopening schools, funding for schools and higher ed and stuff. There's bipartisan agreement there. Funding for testing and
Okay.
vaccines. There is some optimism. I just think that, quite frankly, we had to get the election out of our system, and so I
Yeah.
guess we could still argue, Mark, whether it's still in the system or out of our system. But at least
Well,
right now, there's more openness to have this conversation. Um, you know, you know me well enough, Mark, to know that my personal opinion right now is I'm a little bit skeptical on the timeline. If they're going to do
right.
something by the end of 2020, just understanding that there may be additional uncertainty in the presidential election process. And if Donald Trump were to lose, I don't know how willing he would be to sign a really large package
Before leaving office.
before leaving office. So
Yeah.
I think that some of that's open ended. So I think that there's a possibility that some of these discussions could happen by the end of this
Right.
year, but something formally passing may have to wait till early 2021.
And before we move to the next slide, let me point out, this has been in conversations we've had with our government relations action team that Chris leads. We also need to realize that the one positive with the election being behind us is there had been a great fear leading up to the election that any deal could taint races one way or another. And both parties were afraid to give what would be perceived as a win to the other party. Now that this is kind of cleared out, would you agree that at least you see progress coming because we're not encumbered with the concerns about reelection for a lot of the people that are the key players here?
Yes, that would be my supreme hope as we enter this home stretch in the next, really, I mean, really it comes down to it, next 3 to 4 months.
Okay,
And I think, again, looking at the results, as we said, the message from the American people is we prefer divided government, and we prefer a more essential message. So that means you got to compromise, you got to work together. And I think that the average, whether you're a business owner, whether you're an employee, whether you're a worker, what have you, whether you're a parent, the COVID-19, as we said, the election didn't solve COVID-19 and the impacts that have ravaged industries, and the impacts that could still be to come. That's what we expect Congress and the administration to do. They haven't been able to do that yet. I think that we are on a much better path to get that done after, maybe after Tuesday night, but then certainly maybe after this week. We'll just have to see how it goes. So
Okay.
that's going to eat into that's one of the big policy areas that HFA, that we've been pushing on. And I'll just say this, Mark, as a plug, we've had great engagement from our members in terms of working directly with us and even with their individual members of Congress on the stories. We can't emphasize enough how critical and influential those stories can be about your businesses, how you've survived through COVID-19, some of the strategies you've put in place.
Sure.
to make sure that those stories, we still need them. And
well,
your voice really matters.
We'll let you and I make this plug. I mean, I was going to wait till later in this. By the way, we're halfway through. I want to thank Chris Andreessen for joining us for HFA webinar today, bringing his expertise as our lobbyist in Washington to bear on all this that's going on. But let's pause with there for a second, Chris, because you bring up a great point. Chris was just talking about the fact that putting forth stories is what we'll call it, but really putting a face to these issues and doing that for those decision makers, for not just in Washington, but for leaders in state and local governments as well. And Chris and I had an interesting conversation with the National Governors Association. And this is an association that's a nonpartisan association of governors around the country that they look to for context and background on issues. And when we talked about the needs of this industry and our members at HFA, and Chris, you're my witness to let people know that I'm not embellishing this. They wanted more. They said, we need as much of this as you can give us. This is helpful. We want to know what these businesses, these member businesses, are going through and what they're dealing with. So you're going to be hearing, as membership, you're going to be hearing more from us, really reaching out for that, because that's really good ammunition. Am I overstating that, Chris? Because I don't think I am.
No, absolutely not. I mean, look, the reality is, as they told us, Mark, I mean, everybody, local, state, federal officials, they're all trying to take as much in as possible. And so to the extent that we can have a really coordinated and resourceful, and I think substantive message, which is, I think, HFA we've had all along,
Right.
that is really valuable now. And I think that we've gotten that feedback, whether it's from the NGA or talking specifically to members of Congress in
Sure.
various forums as we've had over this pandemic. And, one of the ways about working virtually is people are available and they want to know, they want to hear. And no business is the same as another. And some of the intricacies around the PPP and how those funds would be deployed on the ground level, HFA and our members really stepped up to provide key guidelines and guidance to whether it's the administration or Congress on how this is actually working on the ground. And that's led to some of the considerations for some of these policy changes.
Love it. What else you got for us here? This is good stuff.
Absolutely.
Good stuff.
So diving into some more specific issues, Mark, the tax, I know the tax issue is one of those things that, in some of the pre-webinar questions and some of the questions we've had from members across the industry.
I'm just going to tell you, we've had tax questions come in since we started this webinar.
Absolutely,
so
absolutely. And again, I think what we heard was from the Biden administration, and Democrats in general, if they were to take back control of Congress, House and Senate, and the presidency, they would look to amend the 2017 Trump tax cuts. The jewel of that being the lowering of the corporate rate to 21%, and the Democrats were very open to say that they were going to increase that corporate rate if they had the opportunity to do that. That, I think, at this point in time, Mark, we can say whether or not Biden wins or Trump wins, or but the control of the Senate presumably staying in Republican hands, that gets taken off the table. So that looks to more targeted type of relief packages. And I will say that COVID-19 relief, obviously the price tag for these bills is very high, into the trillions in some cases. The Biden economic team has said over and over that they're not looking to pay for that with revenue, with any sort of tax increases. They're there's a deficit, they call it deficit spending strategy there. So there's no risk there. And then in some of the more longer term policy agenda items, like an infrastructure package, that's where you could have some of those revenue raisers come in so that you could attempt to pay for some of those long term policies. But again, the risk for any sort of changes to, and I'll say wholesale changes, like big changes to the tax code, we may have some smaller things around tax extenders, things of that nature. But the go big effort on taxes for the Democrats really took a major blow with some of the results over the last several days.
So you're suggesting there's going to be some more consistency there, more maybe some nuance changes there. And I think that the one thing that I heard in some other background that I've been looking at before you and I got on the call today is that we may see movement on things that are more procedural. What I mean by that is like really addressing more about the deductibility of working at home and maybe broadening certain things like that. So maybe looking at that more than you're looking at major tax code changes. Is that fair?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that was something that, we got a lot of questions about, not only for this forum, but so many others, what that agenda looks like. And so, look, the reality is if you're the Biden administration and you're incoming, you're going to have to scale back that agenda when it comes to taxes. And, that's something, at least it will lead to more stability, I think, for our industry and many others in the next couple of years.
Okay. Right,
the other big issue has been trade. Obviously, the issues on trade are predominantly driven by the administration, which is why it's been so active under President Trump. And obviously we've seen a lot of movement. My understanding in talking to various folks is that the Biden administration would place a higher priority on some of these domestic issues, obviously COVID-19, the economy, healthcare, education, rather than trade. Not that nothing would happen on trade, but that it would be a much lower priority item. I'll say this, the Section 301 tariffs from China, that's obviously a big issue. There is bipartisan I use the term dislike. Folks do not agree with that strategy in Congress. But again, it's something that's obviously being challenged in the court as well right now by some industry players. But that is something that the administration was able to unilaterally do. I do not expect that a Biden administration would come in and roll back those tariffs right away. Biden on the campaign trail has said he doesn't like those tariffs, but his advisors have been quick to come behind him and say, but that's not to say we're not going to roll them back right away. The issue of the U.S. and China relationship has shifted pretty significantly under President Trump, and not just in the U.S., but I think globally. And that's something that, so for President Biden, quite frankly, from his record in Congress being more of a supporter of NAFTA, more of a free trade type Democrat, his position changed in this campaign when he was running for president, and he's taken a tougher stand. And so I never thought that whether Trump was reelected or Biden was elected, that the first order of business is not going to be to go soft on China. So I do expect that those 301 tariffs could remain in place. I did want to note that Biden does have an existing relationship. Obviously, I don't believe they've kept it up while he's been out of the White House. But during Biden's time as vice president, he did negotiate kind of a cybersecurity détente with the Chinese. And at that time, it was a vice premier Xi, who's now the premier of China. So there is a relationship there. Wanted to highlight that as well. But then I think the approach is going to change. Donald Trump came in and said, I'm going to negotiate directly with China, right? He did the phase one trade deal. I'm going to do, Vietnam, Korea, Brexit, the UK, EU. He wanted to do all those one-to-one bilaterally. Going back, a few 4 or 5 short years ago, the Obama-Biden administration they used a multilateral approach. So you may remember the Trans-Pacific Partnership. It was a 12-country agreement. Primarily, it was the U.S. and then 11 South Asian countries, not including China, but it included countries like Vietnam, others in Indonesia in the area. that was something that the Obama administration pushed heavily, and they thought they were close to getting it done before he left office, but it didn't happen. And when Trump was elected, he pulled out of that. And then of course it just kind of fell apart because you don't have the US, you don't have that. So that's the approach that we would expect Biden to take, is to perhaps get with some of our other trading partners to put to put pressure on China in that way. That's perhaps a more traditional way of dealing with the trade issues in DC than we've seen from President Trump. But I think that the relationship between the U.S. and China, and then certainly businesses, folks on this call, whether importers, suppliers, et cetera, it's changed. And so that's something that we're continuing to monitor closely.
Would you expect to, throwing this one in here too, with that, with the U.S. Trade Representative 301 investigation to Vietnam, if we had a Biden administration, do you feel they would be less likely, as results of that come out, to impose a tariff there versus a negotiated type of a settlement? Because there's been concern in our industry, obviously manufacturers and retailers, about a tariff thrown on there when you're talking about the fact that right now everybody's paying so much more to get product over here. Any thoughts about that approach? It sounds to me like with these bullet points here, that he'd be less likely to just sort of step forward and just slap a tariff on Vietnam.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, his Biden's view on tariffs is much different than Trump's. And, President Trump has shifted on some issues over the course of his career and his life, but I'd tell you, he's always been a tariff, what do you call himself? The tariff man or Mr. Tariff, something like that. In the Obama administration, there was a Section 301 investigation into China, but there were no, penalties that came from it. So we've seen that play out before, where perhaps nothing tangible has happened, at least not a tariff has come into play. So the Section 301 investigation into Vietnam with respect to illegal logging, I will say that in our conversations, that illegal logging component is a tricky piece to this, especially for Democrats, because that is a big issue for them, just substantively, especially as it relates to climate change. And so I think that there will be, in a new USTR, potentially in a new Biden administration, there would be perhaps a focus on this investigation to see what is happening. But I would agree with your characterization, Mark, that it's less likely in a Biden administration that there would be tariffs imposed from that. Interestingly enough, on that, on Vietnam, with this current administration, we've seen some things move recently, right? Over the summer, there was, the Department of Commerce found that the Vietnam had manipulated currency with respect to a tire import. And I did notice that the Department of Commerce just put some duties on, as a result of that finding, onto those tires. They were low, like 5 to 10%. But I also know, with respect to this industry, there was a preliminary ruling on mattress anti-dumping duties from Vietnam that were pretty high. So we've seen a lot of, just based on this current administration's focus on, that America First agenda and trade in general, we've seen a lot of, anti-dumping orders and cases, petitions brought to the ITC, to the Trade Commission and the Department of Commerce. And those have been ruling favorably, obviously, for domestic players, domestic industry. And so I would expect that would really, again, it may still happen, but I don't think it would happen at the pace that it's happened under this administration.
Gotcha. Appreciate that. I didn't mean to, I know you got a little more to go through.
That's great. Yeah, this is, one of the other issues, obviously, more broadly. I didn't get into specific regulations for for the home furnishings industry. But the reality is, when President Trump came in, there were a few things he said he was going to do, right? The trade agenda we talked about, cut taxes, he did that, and then, reduce regulation. I can tell you, he really reformed the regulatory state here in DC. And whether that was just not filling out all these agencies with various positions, but some of the executive orders that have been put out there in terms of an agency is not able to, produce a regulation unless it gets rid of two. Some of these structural changes, again, we would expect to go away in a Biden administration. So that's significant, right? And I think that, again, going back to the control of Senate, why that's such a critical component here is Republicans in the Senate, if to the extent that they, that they control it, they'll be able to block any sort of efforts to overturn legislatively some Trump administration actions. Now, if President Trump, much like his predecessors, if he did something via executive action, that can be undone via executive action as well. So that's something that President Trump came in and did with some Obama era regulations. Biden's and his team could certainly do that as well. The Republican Congress back in 2016, 17, and 18 did use something called the Congressional Review Act, which again, you only need a majority in the Senate to disapprove and roll back regulations. Without Democrats holding the Senate, they're not able to use that that procedural technique to get at some of these things. So it does. If there's a change in administration, some of those regulatory changes will be more locked in than others. But there will be an opportunity through executive action for Biden to roll some things back that, or maybe again, expand in that case, some of the things that Trump had rolled back. But there'll be less activity in Congress to do that. And as we talked about on the nominations front, that's another key to this whole piece is you have less likelihood, right, of a more liberal or progressive person, say Senator Warren as Treasury or the Secretary, or Senator Sanders in the administration, because Mitch McConnell just, quite frankly, wouldn't bring them up based on that ideology. And so that's going to have a significant impact on the regulatory state and those activities moving forward.
Okay, so we're going to have to, this is something, obviously we don't know what that's going to look like, but the point of the matter is this can change everything from consumer product safety. I mean, you name it, there's just so much that's attached, if you will, to presidential appointments and things of that sort. So interesting. So while we don't know the specific issues, you're just saying anything regulatory, we're going to need to keep an eye on.
Absolutely. I mean,
wow.
again, just historically speaking, right? A Democratic administration is, more likely to be heavy on the regulation. Again, I think that Joe Biden's viewpoint is a little bit on the centrist side. I mean, you mentioned the consumer product safety piece specific to this industry. That's one area that's really interesting. Obviously, you've got the CPSC. There's 5 commissioners. One's vacant. So right now you have 4. 2 Democrats, 2 Republicans. The 2 Democrats that lead that agency right now, one is in his holdover year, so he's sort of, his term officially expired, and then the other one his expires next year. So you could have an opportunity for a Biden administration, if they wanted to they could have 3 opportunities to fill and get the CPSC under Democratic control. But again, that would require extreme cooperation from Mitch McConnell. And quite frankly, when it comes to, so the CPSC is an independent commission, independent agency. When it comes to those, typically on nominations, they move in tandem. So if you nominate 2 Democrats, you usually nominate 2 Republicans on something else, type of thing. So there's a lot to be written there. But yeah, I would just say that control of the Senate, I mean, we mentioned it a couple of times on nominations, I think will be really critical for a number of issues, whether it's policy issues or regulatory issues for this administration.
A terrific run through on all of that. I just want to sort of punctuate the fact that, and again, we've talked about this in our government relations action team, that perhaps for all of our members and everybody listening to this webinar, is to not truly, while you're talking about dynamics here of the situation there, to not truly get up in the partisan piece of it, but to keep focus on the issues themselves. We've made that point a number of times in other gatherings, that it's a question of what I refer to as the steady drumbeat, where we just have to stay. You talked earlier about essential and safe. We're putting out more about that coming up very, very soon as well. How important is it, Chris? I know you live and work in a political environment, but how important is it to sometimes just push that piece of the noise away and really concentrate on the issues? And then, of course, we will have to deal with that political side at some point. But I'm just kind of wondering about how you feel that anybody listening to this should should kind of get their mindset together on how they approach these things.
Absolutely. And I would say, Mark, a lot of our issues, maybe not all, but a lot of our issues as an industry are bipartisan issues, especially when you look at COVID-19 and especially small business relief is something that both sides care about quite a bit, right? And so we bring that, I think, in spades in an association. Obviously, we have businesses of all sizes, but that small business element, I think, gives us a lot of credibility right now. And it's been a key component to our advocacy. Quite frankly, just coming, and again, we're still sort of in the heavy political season of this election. Folks are going to be happy to put that aside for a little bit, right? Because we've been living in this hyper political environment for so long. Folks, people on the Hill have been working virtually. We haven't been able to have that interaction as we had been prior to this pandemic. So there is a lot of, trust me, there's a lot of appetite for moving past the politics of it and getting right to the substance. And that's where I think that we found a lot of success, especially, again, as it relates to the PPP. I mean, that was a $600 billion program that was created over the span of a week. And you had it going out within the span of like 2 weeks. And it was going out to businesses of all different organizations, sizes, and complexities. And we were able to come in with really specific examples of how it was working really well in some areas and how it wasn't in other places. And again, that's not a political conversation. This is something that has been, as we said, a bipartisan program. Sure, were there some things that maybe we would all do again, and maybe Congress too if they had the opportunity? Yes, but it's what we've got. We're playing within that, and I think that message has been really helpful, because once you start getting into the politics, that's when things tend to break down, right? I mean, you think about state and local funding and liability protection. The reason that those things got so bogged down is because they were made so partisan. The other aspects of this, we talked about a multitude of them. They're kind of, I don't want to say they're locked up, but they're in a box. They're ready to be kind of detailed, moved on. Those political conversations, though, quite frankly, I think our impact is so much better and more targeted on the substantive aspects of this, and really bringing, in some cases, the small business, but also just the industry voice to this. And again, showing members of Congress, like, hey, we're trying to do the right thing. I mean, so often, I mean, you and I, Mark, we heard all the stories from some of these smaller generational businesses. These are employees that have been working there for decades. Yep. These are not people that you just, kind of, you're not looking at a piece of paper and just laying them off or what have you. They're part of the family. And so we've been able to bring that case to Congress and let them know how that's played out. Again, not just in COVID-19, but even before. That's how our industry operates.
I agree, and I think it's important to point out, by the way, and one of the things we're so proud of at HFA is that our membership is so broad that we have also the largest retailers joining us, as well as the small and mid-size. And there's been so much that we've worked in lockstep with so many major retailers in dealing with the whole essential and safe issue. I mean, we worked hand in hand with Lazy Boy and Ashley and others on that messaging. And a lot of what you talked about today impacts everybody. Those corporate taxes, there's so much that impacts our entire spectrum of membership, that we've got a lot of issues to cover. But at the end of the day, this is about supporting this industry that's been so good to so many people. We're kind of getting toward the end here. So Chris, what I'd like to do is we've got some takeaways from today that I'd like to just kind of go over these briefly, and we can kind of talk about this. So we just said here, the HFA and its members, that federal issues persist. We must be ready to work with whoever is in office. We just talked about that exact thing. This has got to be issues first, partisanship second. Now, the only caveat to that is, and Chris, you're going to love this plug, is if you've got connections to anybody, no matter which side of the aisle, and they're connected to DC, leverage those things. Let us know, because we would love to have you kick a door open that we could walk through. Furniture retail is well positioned to develop and maintain meaningful relationships with elected officials. This is something we've not talked about a lot here, because we've been Capitol Hill focused today because of this election, and Chris, and what you're doing. But I want you to chime in really quickly on this one too, and that is, I glossed over it a second ago. Local, state governments. This is where the close or not close issues, happen, the shut down or don't shut down. It's where there were nuances as far as what the safety protocols were. If you know your local elected officials, city, state, county, whatever it might be, you can have a huge impact. Chris, we've seen that with members of our government relations action team.
Absolutely. Yeah. And those, you never know, especially in this environment, governors, the federal delegation, a lot of times they're having consistent, regularly scheduled meetings with county commissioners, mayors. That's who they're, a lot of times if they're getting information, they're getting it from those constituencies. So yeah, maintaining those relationships has been, I think, an advantage for our members that have those, especially through the pandemic.
And I think it's also important here, we point out that one of the other takeaways is that really many of these issues have not changed through the pandemic. And when we say we, it's not just Chris and I, the team, whatever it might be, all of us need to have a consistent voice, a consistent message. And that's something that as the association, as your association, we can put that forward. Some other takeaways that we have here, specific impact stories. Chris talked about this. Anything that you as a member, as a retailer can do to paint the picture as to what the impact of these kind of decisions is something that can be really helpful. And Chris, you take those things, and those for you are fuel, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, I think that the staff, at a staff level, right? And they really appreciate that, because again, they can take a face, and what they tell us consistently is, I need to take this to the boss, and he's going to really like to hear this story. And again, those lead to relationships in your community. You have somebody visit your store, things of that nature. So it's not just that story is one thing, whether it's in an email or what have you, and then we can take that and really grow that and capitalize and weave it into our policy platform.
One of my favorite quick aside stories, and Chris, I don't even know if I mentioned this to you, but one of our retailers of the year this year was Breckenridge Furniture in Louisiana. And when we were there visiting them to present them before COVID happened in January, to present them with Retailer of the Year, one of the guests who was making a payment on their account was the mayor. So, it's not just influence, they could also be a customer, I guess, right? I mean, that's something that works out as well. And I do think that what we really learned today is that we really do have a lot of opportunities to really push a lot of these issues, particularly around COVID relief, in these coming weeks, even before we get into the new year. So want to mention that as well. Chris, any final thoughts? We've got about 2 minutes. Any final thoughts you want to bring forward?
It's interesting, Mark, to ask me to reflect on final thoughts. The final thoughts on this election. It's been, again, for my main thought through all this, and related to HFA, has been our issues remain the same. Really, what we're able to do and what we have done throughout the pandemic is really connect back to the members of Congress, and I can tell you that the members and the staff are hyper district focused right now, so much. And I think that the HFA and its membership, just by its nature, is so well positioned to take advantage of that, because we are everywhere. And that's been a real critical piece. The election, again, as with any cycle, there were some things we expected, some things we didn't, and then some things we couldn't. But it's been fascinating to watch it play out and be a little part of history here.
There you go. I want to point out, by the way, one last thing, that if any of you are not involved currently, advocacy is something that is critically important to us here at the Home Furnishings Association. And so if you'd like, you notice in the lower right-hand part of the screen there, it says go.myhfa.org/advocacy. It's going to give you information on the things we're working on, some good benefits there to take a part of, and also I hope it will encourage you to join us and to add your voice. Chris, I just want to thank you so much. I want to mention that any of you that are listening, we're going to be putting this webinar up on our website so that you can enjoy it and share it. A lot of great information. But Chris, we thank you for this update. We know that our work is not done, but the one really underlying message I want to make sure that everybody listening hears, and that is that Chris And that part of our team, all of us at HFA, our members dedicated to this, we're in this for the long haul. This is not just, okay, the election's done, now we can take our foot off the gas. Not the case. We're going to be a steady drumbeat to push forward the issues important to this industry so that we can help you grow your business. I thank you for joining us for HFA webinar. I'm Mark Schumacher, Chris Andreessen. We will see you next time. In the meantime, we hope business is robust and that all of you stay healthy. We'll see you next time.